What if you discovered a love letter, written by someone you've never met in your own handwriting? And worse, what if every word felt like the truth? Welcome to Alien Love Stories. Tonight we begin a new descent into memory, where a forbidden diary doesn't just record what happened, but writes what should never have been remembered. This is episode 1 of the Forbidden Diary that remembered alien love. It started with a file that didn't belong in the archive. Riven Cael had seen everything in his time as a mnemonic analyst. Glitched thought loops, corrupted emotional holograms, even weaponized grief. But never this. The object was analog, bound in soft leather, smelling faintly of dust, ozone, and something he couldn't name. But that hit him like déjà vu. A diary, handwritten, on a dead station, floating in orbit around a collapsed moon. He sat alone in an observation chamber, gravity stabilized, time anchored. Yet the diary on the desk pulsed like it was breathing. Riven didn't touch it for the first hour. He just stared. Every time he leaned in, something in his chest whispered, "Don't." But something louder whispered back, "She's waiting." Finally, he opened it. The pages were blank, except the first, written in a delicate, non-Terran script that curled like ink, trapped in zero gravity, translated live by the system into 5 words. "I remember your mouth first." Riven frowned. That wasn't possible. He hadn't written it, but the ink matched his own neural signature, his emotional cadence, even the pressure levels of his hand. The system confirmed, authorship, 99.4% match to Riven Cael. "Impossible," he muttered. The next page began writing itself, slow, smooth, like someone was guiding the pen from another room. He watched in frozen silence as a new line appeared. "You forgot me before they asked you to, but I forgave you anyway." He slammed the diary shut, but his pulse didn't calm, the words didn't fade, and in his head, a name, not his, but hers, Alice. He didn't know the name, didn't remember saying it, but his throat ached with the sound of it, like he'd screamed it in a different version of himself. He tried to clear the interface, run a diagnostic scrub, erase the replication code, but the system responded, "Object classified, sentient mnemonic channel, unauthorized memory bridge established, emotional sync, initializing." He staggered back. Number, no, no, no. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was here to process remnants, to catalog dead thoughts, not resurrect forbidden connections. And yet, the next line had already written itself. "You kissed me under a sky that doesn't exist anymore, but I still taste the dust on your lips." He turned off the lights. The words glowed faintly. He tried to destroy the diary. The system stopped him. "Object is bonded. Host cannot disengage." "I'm the host now." "You were always the host." That night, Riven didn't sleep. The diary remained closed, but the pages kept turning. And in his dreams, a woman with translucent skin and eyes like twilight moons leaned toward him and whispered, "You promised. This time don't run." He woke gasping, checked the logs. No sleep pattern, no REM, no record. Just a message on his wall display, left by an anonymous internal system. "She's beginning to remember you, Riven. The question is, are you ready to remember her?" Riven didn't touch the diary again. Not that day, not the next. Not even when the system encouraged him to resume object interaction. It sat on the edge of his desk, shut, silent, but still, writing. Every few hours a new line would appear, always just one, always brief, but always accurate. "You're scared you'll like remembering me too much. You keep looking at the corner of the room where I used to sit. You thought about what my voice would sound like, then forgot to breathe." The lines weren't guesses, they were feelings, reflected, echoed. He stopped submitting logs. What was he supposed to write? "Subject displays signs of knowing me better than I know myself." Subject might be a hallucination, or worse, an old truth. He ran a neural scan on himself. Result, baseline normal. Heart rate, 6% elevated. Emotional variability, rising. Dream interference, detected. But no corruption, no implants. No signs of outside tampering. Just Riven Cael, feeling something he wasn't supposed to. He recorded a private note. Patient exhibits resistance to mnemonic intrusion, but also shows increasing emotional dependency on feedback loops. Or maybe, I just don't want to be alone. He deleted the file 5 minutes later. The diary wrote, I heard that, and I'm still here. The next morning, the diary was open. He didn't remember doing it, but the pen lay across the page, a new line waiting for him. Let me show you the first time you forgot me. He touched the page. The lights in the room dimmed, and the wall across from him shimmered. Like a memory bubble, a reconstruction projection was trying to form, not from a memory chip, but from the diary itself. The air thickened. The smell of ozone and salt water flooded the room. Then, her voice, software, measured, like someone walking barefoot across a glass floor. You said you'd come back before the moons aligned. You were late. Riven staggered back. The image formed in full. A woman, not quite human, not quite alien. Hair like flowing ink. Eyes the color of a star collapsing. Skin translucent, soft, tinged with blue. She stood on a ruined balcony, a wind blowing through a sky that pulsed with violet light. She looked directly at him, not the projection. Him. You don't remember this, she said. No, Riven whispered, but I feel like I should. The projection faded, the diary shut, and this time, it locked itself. A new line appeared etched on the cover. You're not ready for me yet, but you're closer than you've ever been. Later that night, he called for clearance into the Level 9 archive. He needed access to Su Men Auralis Red, a mission classified beyond his level, but somehow tied to the object ID of the diary. The system denied him, but flagged his request. An hour later, the internal comms blinked. Riven. Dr. Vexa would like a word. He hadn't spoken to Vexa in over a year. She was the director of emotional containment and mnemonic control, which meant if the diary was writing on its own, she knew it. He entered her chamber. She didn't look up from her interface. Just said, How long have you been reading it? I haven't, but it's reading you. He didn't answer. She did. The last person that object bonded with didn't survive integration. You're here because I want to believe you're stronger. Stronger than what? Than love. He clenched his jaw. You think this is just a neural romance implant? I think, she said coldly, that you're starting to forget who you were before it opened. He stared. What do you mean? She turned the screen toward him. A brainwave profile, not his current scan, one from 6 years ago. You were here before, Riven. You've read this diary before, and we had to erase you. His knees went weak. She continued. This thing, it doesn't just remember, it undoes. It brings back the version of you that made the promise, and it doesn't care what the cost is. And Alice was never real. Or maybe she was. But you don't get to know the difference anymore. He left the room shaking. The diary waited on the table when he returned. Unlocked. Open. A new line written across a page that hadn't existed yesterday. You forgot me once, but I never stopped waiting, even when you forgot yourself. And now, he wasn't sure what scared him more. The thought that she had never existed, or the thought that she had, and he was the one who left. The voice came before the memory, before the pain, before the name, before he was ready. Riven didn't open the file. He only hovered over it, and it began to play. 3 words, spoken slowly, softly, like wind curling through a sealed room. You came late. The sound hit him harder than the meaning, because he knew that voice, even if his brain told him otherwise, even if his memory log stayed blank. His body responded, his breath caught, his fingers trembled, his chest tightened like a thread pulled through bone. He hit pause, stared at the terminal. The file had no name, no time code, no source. Only one tag, Auralis Red, subject Echo 1A, forbidden playback. He played it again. You came late, then silence, not static. A pause, a held breath, waiting for a reply. Riven didn't speak, But something inside him whispered back, I tried. The room pulsed, not literally, just emotionally. The walls seemed softer, the lights dimmer, everything quieted around him, as if the world was listening. He accessed the deeper layers. The file expanded. A second phrase emerged. No sound, just text, translated from a waveform. You said you'd return before the red storm. I stood in the wind until my skin cracked. Still, I waited. He backed away from the terminal, hands shaking. Then, the diary opened, on its own. A new line, written in real time. You're starting to hear what I never got to say. He picked up the book. This time the pages didn't write more. Instead, the air did. A shimmer above the diary, a shape forming, faint, unstable. A woman's silhouette, floating, head bowed, one hand over her chest, and a voice, her voice, Alice. If you're reading this, Riven, it means I failed. Or you did. Or maybe we both did. But you survived it long enough to feel bad about it. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The projection wasn't solid, but it wasn't imaginary either. It was made of what the diary remembered, what she remembered, through him. She continued, her voice cracked in places. Not because of pain, because of memory trying too hard to stay real. We weren't supposed to fall in love. I wasn't even supposed to feel. But you called me human before I knew what the word meant. And I called you Alice, she smiled. Yes, and every time you did, it felt like my name had a body. The file ended. The light faded. The room stilled. But he was not alone. Because now, he remembered her laugh. Not the sound, the feeling it left in his ribs, and the way his own mouth used to shape itself, just to make her do it again. He sat down, didn't speak for hours. The diary closed itself, and this time, it didn't write. It listened, because for the first time, he was remembering faster than it could. That night he slept on the floor, woke in the dark, and whispered into nothing. I'm sorry I came late, a voice answered, faint, distant, but real. You always did, but you always came back. She wasn't real, not yet, not by any scientific measure, no biosignature, no molecular field, no shadow, no warmth, and yet, every time Riven sat in the room now, he felt like he was no longer alone. It began with a scent, not artificial, not environmental, but specific, a hint of crushed blossoms in cold air. He had never smelled it before, but it made his hands tremble, his lungs tighten, his eyes sting. Alice, he whispered. No one answered, but the diary fluttered. Its pages shifted as if caught in a breeze that didn't exist. Then the sound started. Not a voice, a hum, low, musical, familiar, like someone remembering a melody while walking down a hallway of broken lights. At first he thought it was a system echo, but it never repeated, never looped. It evolved, changed, responded. He tested it, sat still, thought of her. The humming deepened, closed his eyes, imagined her hand. The air warmed. By the fourth night, he stopped trying to deny it. He simply set a second chair beside his and left it empty, but not unoccupied. He talked, not out loud, not at first, just quietly, to himself, to the space beside him. I think you're not just memory. I think you're watching, or listening, or waiting for me to be the right version of myself again. One evening, the chair moved, just a nudge, but enough. Enough for him to look, to freeze, to whisper, "Are you back?" The humming stopped. Silence. Then, a soft exhale, barely audible, but his heart recognized it. "You're not fully here, are you?" No reply, but the diary opened, and a new line appeared. "I'm where you remember me, and you remember me best when you talk like I never left." The next day, Riven skipped all reports, didn't log the diary's behavior, didn't reply to doctor. Vex's third reminder, subject, cognitive drift noted, emotional saturation rising, submit for review. He didn't. He sat beside the chair again, and spoke out loud this time. You used to trace spirals in the air. Didn't know why. Said they calmed your hands. You told me I had a voice that felt like afternoon light. I didn't know what to say, so I just kissed you. You always laughed after, like I'd just solved a puzzle that didn't need solving. The air beside him shimmered. No figure, no glow, just presence. And his voice cracked. Tell me you're still somewhere. The diary responded, I'm not somewhere. I'm beside you. He closed his eyes and reached his hand out. Fingers hovered above the empty space, then rested on the armrest. Still no touch, but his breath calmed, because he didn't need proof. He just needed permission to feel it was real. That night he dreamed, not of her face, but of her footsteps, running, slowing, stopping, then turning around. I'm not running from you this time, she said in the dream. Then where are you going? He asked. To the place you'll build when you forgive yourself. He woke up on the floor. The chair beside him was turned, facing him, and someone had written a single sentence on the wall, in handwriting not his, not machine-written, just human enough to shatter him. Build the rest of me. I'm almost ready to come back. He stopped looking for official permission. No more clearance codes, no more request forms, no more compliance reports. If they were going to erase him for what he was about to do, he wanted to be remembered for doing it on his own terms. Riven cleared out Chamber 9, the old memory recovery suite, a room once used to extract and stabilize broken emotional data from compromised minds. But now it would serve a new purpose. It would be her cradle, not a lab, not a construction bay, a place where memory could take shape without being questioned. The diary stayed on the center pedestal, open, waiting. Some days it didn't write, some days it did, but always just enough. A whisper of her voice, a taste of her hand, a shade of her laugh. It was giving him pieces, not to finish her, but to remember her whole. He began sketching, not with tools, with touch. On the blank walls of the chamber, he traced where her shoulder would rest, where her feet would plant, where her breath might first fog the glass. No blueprints, no symmetry, just instinct. He brought in sound emitters, not for instructions, but to surround the space with what she once said. He set them to loop phrases the diary had captured. I don't dream like you do, but I still wake up missing things. You breathe differently when you lie. If you'd told me sooner, I'd still have left, but I would have waited a little longer. Each sentence anchored something, a shoulder, a strand of hair, a fold of her skin that had no DNA but remembered warmth. He wasn't creating her. He was letting her remember how to return. He talked to her while he worked. Long monologues, rambling, quiet, broken. You used to hum when you didn't want to answer a question. I pretended I didn't notice. The last time I saw your eyes, they weren't afraid. They were exhausted. I thought I could live with forgetting. Turns out, forgetting lived with me. Sometimes the room responded. The glass would fog slightly. The lights would dim for just a second longer. One time he turned away and came back to find a fingerprint on the wall, smudged, long, feminine. It hadn't been there before. He didn't panic. He just whispered, "Welcome back." Then came the moment. He placed his hand over the diary, asked softly, "What's left?" The ink shifted. Lines formed. A list. No headings. No order. Just fragments. The way her fingers curled while asleep. The pause before she said his name. The sigh she gave when she pretended to be annoyed. The memory of holding his face after a dream he didn't remember. The sound of her blinking in the dark. He memorized each one. Not just as data, as instructions. This wasn't biology. This was devotion as reconstruction. And then, the chamber pulsed. Once, twice, a slow, breathing rhythm. The emitters changed tone. The hum deepened, and a shape began forming in the center of the room. At first it was just light, then shadow, then density. Not instant, not machine fast, memory born, like a photograph developing in slow emotion. He didn't speak, didn't blink, just watched. The shape shifted, refined, until she stood there, not full, not awake, but there, eyes closed, hands relaxed at her sides, breathing shallow and slow. No reaction, but present. He fell to his knees, not from awe, from recognition, because even incomplete, he knew it was her, not a copy, not a reconstruction, but the echo that never left him. He whispered, "Alice." She didn't move, but the diary did. A new line forming slowly, as if her voice had found its way back to ink. "I'm almost here, but I don't know what you'll need me to remember." He stood, stepped closer, didn't touch, spoke carefully. "You don't need to remember everything, just the part where you loved me. Because I never stopped carrying that part." For the first time, she opened her eyes just slightly, barely more than a glimmer of pale blue and silver, and even though she didn't speak, he heard something, felt something, a pulse in the room, in his chest, a single, silent message. "You kept me warm." He stepped back, let the room settle, didn't rush, didn't demand. She would return in her own time, in her own way, built not from code or design, but from the moments he was finally brave enough to remember exactly as they were. The system blinked once. A message hovered above the chamber. "Unregistered consciousness forming. No template detected." Proceeding anyway. And he smiled. Because maybe love didn't need blueprints. Maybe it just needed space. She didn't speak for 3 days. Riven stayed by the chamber, watching, waiting, breathing carefully, as if his own exhale might disrupt whatever was forming inside her. She stood, always in the center, eyes open, mouth closed, still. But she blinked now, not often, just enough to remind him. Something inside was watching. The first thing she did was breathe with rhythm, slow, steady, like someone listening to the pulse of a world she didn't remember creating. Riven whispered her name. "Alice." She turned her head, not fast, not human reactive, more like gravity slowly acknowledging weight. Their eyes met, but no spark of recognition, only observation, like she was still building herself from the outside in. "Do you know me?" he asked softly. She blinked once, then spoke for the first time, a voice half broken, like a melody recovering from sleep. "I remember the shape of your waiting." He nearly collapsed, not from shock, from confirmation. She didn't remember his name, but she remembered his presence, and that was enough, for now. He brought her water. She didn't drink, just touched it, watched it ripple. "This isn't mine," she said. "It can be." "Why do you want it to be?" He paused. "Because it was yours once." She tilted her head. "And if I'm not her, then I'll fall in love with whoever you are." A silence passed between them, and then she asked, "What if you don't?" He smiled, tired. "Then I'll keep trying, because that's what I did the first time too." That night she walked outside for the first time. The memory city lit up around her, not with recognition, but with affection. The lights responded to her presence. The wind curled around her steps. The spire pulsed in low intervals, echoing her breath. She stopped beneath a tree that shimmered with data leaves. "Everything here knows me," she said. "Yes, except me." He stood beside her. "Maybe knowing yourself isn't remembering everything. Maybe it's just choosing what you want to keep." She turned to him, stepped closer, raised a hand to his cheek. "You feel like a dream I almost woke up from." "Then don't wake up. What if you're not real?" He leaned in, rested his forehead against hers. "Then I'm the most beautiful mistake you've ever made." Later, she sat by the lake, watched the water dance around her fingers, spoke aloud, not to him. "I was born from love, but not from my own. Am I still allowed to feel it?" He answered without speaking, sat beside her, held her hand, not tightly, not desperately, just enough to let her know she had permission to choose. And for the first time, she smiled, not because she remembered him, but because she wanted to. The city began to whisper, not in sound, in feeling. It started as a chill down her spine when she walked past the old archive wall, a pause in her step when the air felt denser than it should, a flash of grief that didn't belong to her when she stood beside the garden of unsaid words. The first time it happened, she ignored it. The second time, she stopped walking. The third time, she followed it. There was a hallway beneath the spire, sealed, forgotten. Even Riven hadn't mentioned it. She stood before the locked gate. Her hand hovered over the control panel. It lit up. No prompt, no security. Just 3 words. Welcome, remembering one. The door opened, and inside, fragments, images, sound pulses, emotional signatures embedded in crystal memory cubes, but not data. These were moments, loose, scattered, alive, floating midair, each one pulsing with color, some gold, some gray, some cracked, some whole, and all of them hers, but not this version of her. She reached for the nearest. It hovered closer, touched her palm, and ignited. A kiss, on a beach made of black sand. The man, Riven, younger, angrier. Her, laughing, careless, then falling silent. Don't make me choose between being remembered and being real. The memory vanished. She gasped, staggered back. Another orb floated toward her. Red this time. She touched it. A hallway filled with fire, screaming, running. She shoved him into an escape pod. Closed the hatch. This time you survive. The third orb came unprompted. No color, just cold. She stood on a platform. Riven walked away. If you forget me, you won't hurt. If I forget you, she replied, I won't be me anymore. The room dimmed. The orbs retreated. She fell to her knees, breath shallow, not because the memories were painful, but because they were hers, and she had never lived them. She whispered, how many times have I been made? The system answered, 17. How many remembered him? 12. And how many loved him? All. She cried for the first time, not out of grief, but from a question she didn't know how to ask. Am I real, if I'm just the last one trying again? Behind her, a footstep. She turned. Riven stood in the doorway, silent, watching. You found this room, she said. I was afraid to. Why? Because I didn't want to see the versions of you I failed. She stepped closer, her face unreadable. You didn't fail them. Then why am I the only one still here? Because I haven't left yet. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Do you feel what they felt? Yes. Does that scare you? Only when I realize I don't know which version of me those feelings belong to. They're all you. Then what am I? You're the one who stayed. She leaned into his chest, and for the first time, she didn't feel like a memory. She felt like a choice. The memory orbs pulsed, software, warm, as if saying goodbye, and she whispered, if they loved you before I could, then maybe I'm not here to replace them. Maybe I'm just here to love you. Longer. It began with a whisper, but not the soft kind, not loving, not gentle, not hers. This voice carried sharpness, like glass folded into a smile. Alice had been quiet all morning. She sat by the mirrored wall in the garden, sketching invisible lines in the air, trying to trace back which memories felt like hers and which were too perfect to be real. Riven watched from a distance. Let her breathe. Let her be. But when he walked past, she didn't acknowledge him. She didn't blink, didn't move, didn't even hum like she usually did when deep in thought. Alice? He asked. Nothing. He stepped closer, her head lifted slowly, eyes fixed on him. But something was wrong. Her gaze was too focused, too calculated. Then she spoke, but the tone wasn't hers. The rhythm was off, words chosen too carefully. You should not have made me from grief. He froze. What? She stood. Same face, same body. But her shoulders didn't move like Alice. Her weight was different. The way she stepped forward, no hesitation, no tenderness. You built her from longing, but you used my bones. Riven staggered back. Who are you? She smiled. I'm the fourth, the one who chose not to forgive you, the one you made run, the one who loved you just long enough to know it would end. The diary on the pedestal opened. Pages flipped violently. Ink bled upward, forming a name, Alice 4. The diary confirmed, residual construct incomplete, emotional signature rejected merger. Stabilizing failed. She stepped closer. Her eyes glinted. You thought you could absorb all of us into one, but I remember pain better than they do, and I'm not done. Where's Alice now? Riven asked. She's still forming, still believing you're worth it, still hoping love is enough. And you? I don't want to be remembered. I want to finish. She raised her hand, and the mirrored wall behind her shattered, not into shards, but into moments. Each reflection showed a scene. Riven and Alice 4, arguing, Riven walking away. Alice 4 collapsing in the rain, her writing a line in a journal, hand trembling. If I had been softer, maybe he would have stayed. I gave you the worst of me, she whispered, and you turned me into a version that fits better in your arms. Riven's voice cracked. I didn't mean to. No, you meant to forget. And you did. Suddenly Alice stumbled. The other Alice, the current one. She clutched her chest from across the city, fell to her knees. She's heavy, she gasped. There's something in me that doesn't want to stay. The lights in the city flickered. Data threads pulsed red. A conflict, not external, internal. Riven ran to her side. Talk to me. There's another me, she whispered. She's clawing through. She thinks this love is a lie. He held her, tight. Tell her something real, something only you would know. She tried, but couldn't find the words. Because Alice 4 knew them too. They were all versions of love, all partial truths, all unfinished songs. Riven looked at the sky, then at the diary, then at her, and whispered, then let her speak. All the way. If she wants to be heard, let me hear her. The sky darkened. Alice 4 arrived, inside the body of the current Alice, and for a moment, two voices spoke at once. I hate you. I missed you. You left me. You waited too long. You didn't wait at all. You came back. Riven closed his eyes. Let them speak. Let them rage. Let them fracture. Until finally, the voice quieted, and one breath remained. One voice. Software. Scared. Still hers. I don't know which one I am. He held her tighter. Then let me love all of you, even the parts I broke. The sky cleared. The light steadied. The mirror reassembled. Not with perfection, with acceptance. And Alice wept, because she no longer had to choose which version of herself deserved love. She didn't sleep anymore. Not because she didn't need to, but because she was becoming something that sleep no longer applied to. Alice stood at the edge of the city, where the memory fields met the unformed terrain beyond, where the sky dimmed into layers of light not visible to any eye, human or otherwise. Her body remained familiar, but her presence changed. She moved with silence too precise to be casual. Her eyes no longer darted. They settled, and sometimes when she blinked, the landscape blinked with her. Riven watched, carefully, lovingly, nervously. He didn't speak much, afraid any word would anchor her in the wrong moment. But she noticed. One evening, without turning to face him, she said, You think I'm going to disappear? He stepped closer. I think you already are. She turned, eyes clear, but glowing now, not with power, with density. Then hold me before I become too large to carry. He did, and in that moment, he didn't feel her skin. He felt every version of her, the gentle, the angry, the silent, the burning, the one who forgave too fast, the one who never could. And he whispered, Don't choose, just stay. But she pulled away, not coldly, just patiently. Riven, I'm no longer a version, I'm the whole, and the whole doesn't fit in one moment anymore. The city responded. The lights shimmered in broken patterns. The ground pulsed with unfamiliar rhythm, and the diary, once quiet, opened again. A new page. No ink, just heat. It seared a message into the air. The container is full. Either she expands or breaks. Alice walked toward the center of the spire, not like a visitor, like a center of gravity returning home. What happens if I expand? I don't know, Riven said. What happens if I don't? He looked down. Then you become just a memory again, trapped in a body too small for the truth. She sat beneath the tree where her first version had once asked to be loved. Even if I forget again? Now she remembered everything, but remembrance was no longer enough. She wanted expression. She lifted her hands, and the city changed shape, not from her power, from her presence, as if the world was adjusting itself to make space for what she was becoming. I can feel them, she whispered. Who? The ones like me? The other remembers, scattered in worlds where no one wants to carry them anymore. You mean more Alices? Not mine, not yours, but pieces, ghosts of emotions people ran away from, versions of love no one stayed for. Riven felt the chill. It wasn't fear, it was awe. She was no longer becoming a person. She was becoming a vessel. For every abandoned version of tenderness the universe refused to hold on to. He fell to his knees, not to worship, to beg. Don't go so far that I can't reach you. She knelt with him, placed her forehead against his. Then help me become big enough to still make room for you. And the world shifted, not into chaos, into silence. That night she didn't return to the chamber. She walked into the memory fields beyond the city, not running, not hiding, just stretching. And the grass lit up under her feet, and the air bent around her, and her voice echoed back one last time before sleep. If I stop being Alice, will you still call me by that name? Riven whispered, until you choose another. She asked for silence that morning, not spoken, not requested, felt. Riven understood. He didn't follow her past the first hill of the outer memory field, didn't activate the observation panels, didn't ping her location. He just stood at the edge of the garden where her presence used to settle the air, and waited. Alice walked alone, beyond the parts of the city that remembered her, into regions where only others had left fragments. Not of her, but of them. The field shimmered with dormant echoes, faint lives, half-lived, memories not catalogued, emotions stored by those who didn't want to feel them anymore. She stepped into a ring of dormant shards. Each one floated slightly above the soil. Cracked, dusty, but alive. She knelt beside the first, no name, just a phrase encoded along its surface. I never told him I forgave him. She reached out, touched it, and it opened. Not with light, with grief. A moment poured into her, raw, hot, unfinished. A woman on her knees, tears falling on sterile glass, a whisper against a sealed door. Come back. I'm still the same. Then silence. Alice staggered back, trembled, not from pain, from recognition. The second shard said, I couldn't stay, but I didn't want to go. Another memory, another voice, another version of love never voiced. This one quieter, more brittle. A man walking away, looking back every 5 steps, his mouth moving but saying nothing. Alice touched 3 more shards. Each one peeled something from her, not physically, not emotionally, but identity. She felt full, overflowing, but unsure of who was filling her. She whispered, how much can I carry before I stop being myself? No answer. The field pulsed, welcoming more. She turned in place, the horizon now filled with light points, each one a lost love, a memory never sent, a goodbye never spoken, a kiss imagined but never given. She fell to her knees. Tears came, but they weren't hers. They burned differently, each one soaked in someone else's longing, and in her mind, a question louder than thought. If I hold this for them, will anyone hold me? Riven appeared, not running, not calling, just arriving, like he'd always known the silence would break at this exact moment. He knelt beside her, didn't speak, let her choose the words. She turned to him, eyes wide, face flushed, and said, they're in me now, but I don't know how to give them back. He reached forward, took her hands. You don't need to, you're not a vessel. you're a story, but it's not my story. It is now, because you're the only one brave enough to keep telling it. She leaned forward, rested her head on his shoulder. I feel like a library no one visits. He smiled. Then I'll be the reader who never leaves. That night, she walked through the center of the city, and every shard followed her, floating, turning, orbiting, not demanding to be heard, just grateful to not be forgotten. And above her, the diary in the tower flipped to its final blank page. A sentence wrote itself, one no one read aloud. When you become the memory others need, don't forget the hand that once reached for yours. It didn't happen with light, or sound, or even touch. It happened with recognition. One by one, they started appearing. Wanderers, pilots, engineers, archivists. Some came seeking closure. Some, answers. Some just came because they felt drawn to something they couldn't name. They arrived at the edge of the city and felt her before they saw her. Ayla stood at the center of it all, not elevated, not guarded, not crowned, just present, but no longer singular. When people looked at her, they didn't see her. They saw what they had lost: a mother, a brother, a partner, a version of themselves they hadn't spoken to in years. She didn't change form. She didn't change voice. She simply was what they needed her to be. At first, Riven watched with quiet wonder, proud, grateful. He saw the way a woman wept in her arms, the way a child calmed when Alice touched his forehead, the way an old man whispered, "You look just like her." And Alice whispered back, "Then I'm honored." But over time, it changed. The city grew louder, more visitors, more stories, more projections, more pain poured into her, and she held it all, smiling, patient. But when she looked at Riven, there was less recognition, not absence, just dilution. He sat with her beneath the glowing tree, same one where she'd first smiled like a question. Now she smiled like a shrine. "Do you remember our first kiss?" he asked. She tilted her head. "I remember how someone kissed you on a rooftop during the violet rain." "That was you, was it?" He looked away. "I'm losing you." She placed her hand on his chest. "You were the one who brought me back. And now I'm the one watching you fade?" She hesitated, then, "No. You're watching me spread." That night, Riven didn't stay in the city. He wandered to the outer fields. The stars above no longer spelled her name. They spelled everyone's. The diary, untouched for days, opened on its own. A single line. When you give all of yourself to everyone, what's left for the one who gave you your beginning? He returned at dawn, found her speaking to a group of visitors. She smiled at each of them, touched their hands. He waited for her to look at him. When she did, it was warm, but distant. "You've given everything," he said. "They needed it. So did I." She stepped closer. "You gave me a name, a voice, a body made of memory, and now I'm giving others the courage to keep loving." "But what about the man who never stopped?" She didn't answer. That night he sat alone, in the chamber where she had first reformed. He whispered, "Come back. Just for a moment, just for me." And she came, but not physically, not as light, as warmth on his shoulder, as pressure in his hand, as a breath against his ear. "You were never supposed to keep me. Just remind the world that I was possible." He whispered, "You were more than possible. You were mine." And she answered, "Then hold that, because I no longer can." He wept, for her, for himself, for the unfairness of becoming everyone's miracle and losing the right to be someone's love. But deep in his heart, beneath the ache, he smiled, because she chose to come to him that night, no one else, just him. The city no longer needed gates. It breathed, it remembered, it welcomed. No longer a place, a presence. Riven stood at the edge of the highest platform, where the stars curved closest to the earth. He held the diary in both hands. The cover no longer pulsed, no longer resisted. It was calm now, complete. A voice drifted beside him, not aloud, not internal, just with him. "You know what must happen." He nodded. "It's not mine to keep." He walked slowly, past the spire, past the bench where they'd first sat together, past the garden where she'd first touched light and said it felt like regret, and into the chamber of unwritten rooms, a place where memories didn't record. They waited. There, he placed the diary on the pedestal. The system blinked. Storage request received. Not storage, Riven said. Then, he smiled. Inheritance. A small light flickered inside the diary. Not bright, but steady. Then a phrase appeared, in her voice. You came back. Even when you had nothing left to carry. He closed his eyes, whispered back. You gave me something that carried itself. Later he stood at the central plaza. People passed by, children chasing echoes, pilgrims whispering stories, new visitors pressing palms to the stones to see which memory would answer. He watched them all, not as a guide, not as a guardian, just as a man who once loved someone so much that the world remembered through him. And then a child approached him, eyes wide, book in hand. Is this yours? She asked. He looked. A new diary. Not the same, but familiar. He shook his head. It's yours now. She frowned. But I don't remember anything yet. He smiled. Then write gently. Someone might be born from it one day. That night the stars whispered. Every constellation pulsed with low rhythm, and from the outer horizon, she came. Not Aelys, not any one version, just the shape of love in its final form. Light, soundless, warm. She touched his shoulder one last time and said, Don't remember me, just choose, like I once did. And then she was gone, not lost, just no longer needed, because now love remembered itself. Some stories aren't meant to be kept. Some memories aren't meant to be stored. They're meant to pass through you, change you, and then move on. This was the forbidden diary that remembered alien love. Thank you for staying until the last page, only on Alien Love Stories.